The story begins with the rookie officer, a young man fresh out of training, full of energy, confidence, and perhaps a bit too much pride. His name is Officer Jordan, and he's determined to make a name for himself in the police force. He was well liked in the academy, known for his sharp mind, quick reflexes, and his ability to get things done. But there was one thing that often set him apart from others: his arrogance. Jordan believed he was ready for anything, and he expected to be treated as if he was already a seasoned officer, even though this was his first assignment. When he was assigned to work under Judge Robinson, a well-respected black judge with over 20 years of experience, Jordan felt both nervous and excited. He knew that Judge Robinson had a reputation for being strict and firm, but also fair. People in the courthouse spoke highly of him, and many saw him as a role model for young lawyers and officers. But Jordan didn't see it that way. He thought the judge was stuck in the past, too slow to adapt to the changing times, and too cautious with his decisions. To Jordan, Judge Robinson's methods seemed outdated, and he was ready to prove that a new generation could bring fresh ideas and efficiency to the table. From the very first day in the courtroom, Jordan noticed that the judge's style was different. Judge Robinson took his time to carefully consider every case, listening to all sides before making any decisions. Some of the younger officers and lawyers in the courtroom looked impatient, but the judge remained calm, as if he had all the time in the world. Jordan, however, wasn't impressed. He saw it as indecision and a lack of authority. He was eager to prove that he knew better, that the old ways weren't always the best ways. Jordan, with his bold personality, decided that this was the perfect opportunity to show everyone that he was capable of more than just following orders. The rookie couldn't help himself. Whenever he saw a moment to speak up, he did. He would interrupt the proceedings to offer his own opinion, sometimes in the middle of the judge's sentences. His suggestions weren't always well thought out, but he was convinced that they were better than anything the judge had to offer. At first, no one in the courtroom dared to say anything. They all knew who Jordan was, a new officer eager to prove himself. But the judge, despite his age, wasn't someone who would let disrespect slide, especially not from a rookie who had only been on the job for a short time. The atmosphere in the courtroom started to shift. There was an underlying tension as Jordan's interruptions became more frequent. The judge, for the most part, remained calm and composed, refusing to let the rookie's outbursts affect his judgment. But there was no denying that Jordan's actions were starting to frustrate the people in the room. His constant challenges to the judge's authority were beginning to disrupt the flow of the trial. Jordan's actions didn't just annoy the judge. They made the other officers, lawyers, and even the witnesses uncomfortable. As Jordan continued to push boundaries, it became clear that his arrogance was clouding his better judgment. He had come into the courtroom expecting to show everyone how much he knew, but he was quickly realizing that respect, not authority, was what made a good officer. He had underestimated Judge Robinson's wisdom and experience, and now the rookie was about to learn a valuable lesson that would change his view on leadership, authority, and what it truly meant to serve with respect. The scene is set for a confrontation. The stage is ready for what would become a turning point in Jordan's career, though he still couldn't see it coming. What would happen next was something no one, not even Jordan, could have predicted. As the days passed, Officer Jordan grew more and more confident in his belief that he was the one who had all the right answers. He would watch Judge Robinson from his position, observing the way the judge ran his courtroom with quiet authority. To Jordan, it seemed like the judge was stuck in the past, moving slowly, deliberating over every detail, as if the world was waiting for him. The rookie was sure that there was a faster, more efficient way to handle things. He believed that the old methods needed to be changed, and he was the one to do it. One morning, during a particularly complicated case involving a local businessman accused of fraud, the tension in the courtroom was thick. The defense lawyer was making a long, drawn-out argument about his client's innocence, while the prosecution tried to keep up. The witnesses were starting to lose focus, their words becoming less clear, and Jordan could feel the impatience growing in the air. He shifted in his seat, looking around at the faces of the people in the room. They were all waiting for the judge to make his move, but to Jordan, it felt like the judge was hesitating, missing an opportunity to push forward. It was then that Jordan decided he could no longer stay quiet. His gut told him it was time to act. He stood up, catching the attention of everyone in the room. The judge paused mid-sentence, looking at him with calm eyes. Jordan, filled with energy, saw the perfect opening to make his point. "Your Honor," Jordan began, his voice clear and firm, "we've already heard enough. We don't need to go on with these lengthy arguments. It's obvious what's going on here. We need to move this case forward." There was a brief pause. The judge's gaze didn't waver, but the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how the judge would respond. Jordan stood there, feeling the weight of his decision, but also feeling a sense of victory. He had spoken up. He was ready to make the courtroom run like a well-oiled machine, the way he thought it should be done. But Judge Robinson's response was not what Jordan had expected. Instead of reacting angrily or quickly agreeing with him, the judge simply raised his hand, signaling for Jordan to remain silent. The room was silent as everyone waited for the judge's next move. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Judge Robinson spoke softly, yet with great authority. "Officer Jordan," he began, his voice steady and calm, "your energy is commendable. But in this courtroom, we don't rush. We don't jump to conclusions without careful consideration. Every case, every word, matters." Jordan felt a brief moment of embarrassment wash over him. He had been so sure of himself, but now, under the judge's gaze, he realized his eagerness to move things along was not the same as understanding the process. Judge Robinson's words stung, but they were not harsh. They were a quiet reminder of the deep experience and wisdom that only years in the courtroom could give. The rookie officer tried to regain his composure, but the judge's words had already started to shift his thinking. He stood there, silently taking in the lesson that was unfolding in front of him. The judge's calm demeanor was in stark contrast to his own impulsive actions, and in that moment, Jordan felt a sense of discomfort. He was used to being in control, used to thinking that he could change things with a snap of his fingers. But now, he understood that there was more to being an officer than just moving things along quickly. There was an art to it, one that required patience and respect for the process. The judge returned his attention to the case, and Jordan, though still unsettled, sat back down. He couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had challenged authority, but in doing so, he had learned something that he would never forget. The way Judge Robinson had handled the situation was a perfect example of what true leadership looked like: calm, steady, and thoughtful. Jordan realized that he had a lot to learn, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to swallow his pride. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore the lesson he had just been taught. The rookie officer wasn't sure what was coming next, but he now had a sinking feeling that the next part of this story wouldn't be something he could simply brush off. The next day, Officer Jordan found himself back in the courtroom. The incident from yesterday was still fresh in his mind, but he didn't want to admit to himself that the judge's words had made an impact. He walked into the room with his usual confidence, determined not to show any weakness. But deep down, he knew that things weren't quite the same. His previous actions had been a challenge to Judge Robinson's authority, and he wasn't sure how the judge would respond this time. It didn't take long for Jordan to notice something had changed. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt different. The tension was thicker now, but it wasn't just because of the case. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Jordan, still full of his youthful arrogance, couldn't help but feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, as though they were all silently watching to see if he would continue to push boundaries or if he had learned his lesson. Judge Robinson entered the room, his presence as calm and dignified as ever. He didn't acknowledge the tension. He simply nodded to the officers and sat down at his bench. The case for the day was straightforward. a domestic dispute involving a young couple, but the judge's manner was as serious as it had been the day before. He began the proceedings, his voice calm and steady as he addressed the court. But Jordan, still feeling the sting of his previous challenge, couldn't help but watch the judge closely. The rookie had an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach, but he wasn't ready to let that stop him. He had something to prove. He couldn't let the judge's calm demeanor intimidate him. His pride wouldn't allow it. He needed to show that he could handle the pressure, that he was capable of making decisions and moving things along quickly. The moment felt perfect for him to take charge again. When the defense attorney began to speak, Jordan couldn't help but notice that he was dragging things out. The words seemed to go in circles, and it appeared as if he wasn't getting to the point. Jordan shifted in his seat, barely able to control his frustration. He looked around the room and saw the same tired expressions on the faces of the lawyers and officers. They were waiting for something to happen. And Jordan, feeling the need to take charge, stood up without thinking. "Your Honor," Jordan began, his voice louder than usual. "We don't need to hear all of this. It's clear where this is going. Let's move forward." The entire courtroom went silent. The judge, who had been listening attentively to the defense attorney, slowly looked up. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something more powerful, an unwavering calm. Jordan's heart began to race as he realized what he had just done. Once again, he had interrupted the flow of the courtroom, but this time it felt different. There was no immediate reaction from the judge, no reprimand. The silence stretched on for a long moment, and for the first time, Jordan felt the weight of his actions. Judge Robinson looked at him, his gaze steady but not harsh. "Officer Jordan," he said softly, "you seem eager to move forward, but sometimes the process takes time. We don't rush to conclusions. We make sure all voices are heard. We do not silence others to make ourselves feel heard." Jordan felt his face flush. The judge's words were simple, but they hit harder than he expected. The room was still quiet, and Jordan could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. He wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable. He thought he was helping, but instead, he had just revealed his own impatience and lack of understanding. He sat down again, this time with a sinking feeling in his chest. The judge didn't even look at him as he returned his attention to the case. Jordan couldn't help but notice how effortless it seemed for the judge to maintain control of the room. There was no need for loud commands or interruptions. It was all in the way he carried himself, the respect he had earned from years of experience. The trial continued without any more interruptions, but Jordan's mind was racing. He realized that the more he tried to push his way forward, the more he was reminding everyone around him of his lack of experience. It was clear now that what the judge had been trying to teach him was not just about following orders, but about understanding the weight of his actions. It wasn't enough to be quick and bold. He needed to learn patience, humility, and how to let others speak before rushing to conclusions. As the day wore on, Jordan's thoughts became clearer. The lessons from the judge were starting to sink in, but he wasn't sure how to change his approach. For the first time, he began to understand the power of listening and observing, of letting. The next day, Jordan entered the courtroom feeling a mixture of frustration and determination. He had spent the entire night thinking about his actions, wondering if he had made a mistake by challenging Judge Robinson. The quiet words the judge had spoken to him the day before replayed in his mind. "We don't silence others to make ourselves feel heard." Jordan wasn't used to feeling this unsure of himself. He had always been confident, even to the point of arrogance, but now, for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if his approach was the right one. As he walked into the courtroom, he noticed that things seemed a little different. The air felt heavier, like everyone was anticipating what would happen next. His fellow officers, the lawyers, and even the witnesses seemed to be watching him more closely than usual. Jordan didn't like the feeling. He had been the one to cause the tension, and now it seemed to be following him. He tried to shake it off, but it lingered. When Judge Robinson entered the room, there was the usual sense of calm that surrounded him. The judge didn't make any dramatic entrances. He simply walked to the bench with a quiet authority that commanded respect. He didn't glance at Jordan as he sat down. It was as if he had already made up his mind about the rookie officer. For a moment, Jordan felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him, but he quickly pushed it down. He was here to do a job, and that's what he was going to focus on. The case for the day was a burglary trial, and the defendant was a young man who had been caught in the act. The defense was arguing that the defendant had acted out of desperation due to a troubled home life. The prosecution, however, was firm in their belief that the crime was premeditated. The arguments were intense, but Jordan found himself paying less attention to the case than he had in the past. His mind kept drifting back to the lesson the judge had tried to teach him, that patience and respect were just as important as action. As the defense attorney continued to speak, Jordan couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration again. He watched the lawyer go on, repeating points that Jordan thought were unnecessary. He felt his hands begin to sweat, the same impatience creeping back into his chest. He could feel his mouth drying, and before he knew it, his legs were moving. He stood up, ready to interrupt once more. This time, though, he stopped himself. He paused, standing at the edge of the courtroom. For the first time, he questioned what he was about to do. Was it necessary to speak up again? Was it more important to make his point or to listen and let the process unfold? Jordan's confidence wavered for a brief moment, but he wasn't ready to give up completely. Instead of speaking, he sat back down. To his surprise, that small act of restraint felt like a victory. He wasn't entirely sure what he had learned, but he understood that sitting still and allowing the case to continue was more powerful than interrupting. Judge Robinson glanced at him for the briefest moment, and though he didn't say anything, Jordan could see the faintest hint of approval in the judge's eyes. The rest of the trial continued without incident. Jordan stayed quiet, focusing on the proceedings. He listened closely to every argument, and for once, he didn't feel the urge to rush things along. The case was complicated, and it was clear that there was no quick fix. The judge's careful consideration of each detail made sense to him now. By the end of the trial, the rookie officer was surprised at how much he had learned, not just about the law, but about how to approach life with a little more patience, humility, and respect. When the trial concluded and the courtroom began to clear, Jordan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from winning a case or getting the right answer. It was the kind of peace that came from understanding that sometimes the best thing you could do was nothing at all. Sometimes stepping back and letting others speak was the most powerful thing you could offer. He walked out of the courtroom, feeling different than he had before. The tension that had clouded his mind seemed to lift. He wasn't completely changed, and he still had a lot to learn, but he knew that he had taken the first step toward becoming the kind of officer he wanted to be. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but he knew that it would be a lot smoother if he remembered to walk it with respect, patience, and an open mind. The next few days in the courtroom were different for Officer Jordan. After the previous trial, he felt a shift inside him, a quiet realization that the way he had been thinking about his job and his role had to change. He wasn't sure if it was the judge's calmness or the way the courtroom had settled into a rhythm without any interruptions, but something had clicked. Jordan began to understand that his rush to prove himself wasn't as important as understanding the bigger picture. He wasn't just there to push cases along. He was there to learn and serve with respect. Judge Robinson, as usual, walked into the courtroom with his usual composed presence. Jordan watched him closely that day, noticing how the judge never seemed to hurry. He made decisions with confidence, but without rushing, taking the time to listen to all sides before making a call. Jordan had begun to admire the judge's patience. There was a strength in it, a quiet power that came from experience, not force. On this particular day, the case was a minor one. An elderly woman accused of shoplifting from a local store. The evidence was clear. The woman had been caught on camera taking items she hadn't paid for. The defense, however, claimed that the woman's actions were due to her declining health and confusion. It was a simple case, but Jordan found himself paying attention more than he ever had before. He wasn't just waiting for it to end or looking for ways to hurry things along. Instead, he was absorbing the details, watching how Judge Robinson handled it all. The trial began, and the defense lawyer stood up, arguing that the elderly woman's actions weren't criminal in intent, but rather a result of her deteriorating mental health. He spoke kindly about her situation, asking for compassion. Jordan could see how important it was for the judge to listen to every word, to fully understand the context of what had happened. This wasn't about guilt or innocence in the simplest terms. It was about understanding the human side of the case, the circumstances that led to this moment. Jordan glanced at the judge, who was listening intently, his expression neutral but thoughtful. He could see that the judge wasn't distracted, wasn't thinking ahead to what he was going to do next. Judge Robinson's attention was completely focused on the lawyer's words. It was a simple act, but Jordan found it impressive. He had been too eager to rush things before, but now he realized that patience didn't just make things easier. It made the decision-making process more thoughtful and meaningful. The prosecutor stood next, arguing that the woman had broken the law and should be held accountable for her actions. Jordan noticed how the prosecutor's tone was much sharper, less concerned with the woman's personal situation. He could see that both sides were passionate about their positions, but it was clear that Judge Robinson wasn't judging the woman's actions solely on what was being said. He was weighing everything: the law, the facts, and the woman's background. The trial proceeded, and Jordan found himself reflecting on the nature of justice. It wasn't black and white. The truth wasn't always easy to find. Sometimes, the right decision wasn't the one that followed the law to the letter, but the one that took into account the human being standing in front of you. He understood now that his role wasn't just to enforce the law. It was to think about it, to understand it, and to apply it in a way that was fair, not rushed. As the trial went on, Jordan kept thinking about the lessons the judge had taught him. He knew he wasn't perfect. He still had a lot to learn about patience, humility, and respect, but he also understood that he was changing. Little by little, he was beginning to see the bigger picture. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was starting to see his role in the courtroom as part of something much larger than himself, a system that required wisdom, understanding, and time. By the end of the day, the judge ruled in favor of the elderly woman, giving her a chance to get help for her condition instead of sending her to jail. The decision was exactly what Jordan had hoped for, though it wasn't what he had expected when the trial started. It wasn't about punishment, it was about understanding. As the courtroom emptied, Jordan stood there, thinking about how much he had learned in just a few short days. He didn't know if he was ready to completely let go of his old ways, but he knew that he had made progress. And in that moment, he felt a small sense of pride, not in himself, but in the work he was beginning to understand more deeply. As the days passed, Officer Jordan found himself adjusting more and more to the rhythm of the courtroom. The confidence that had once driven him to rush things along, to push his own ideas, began to fade. In its place was a new understanding. He didn't need to prove himself through interruptions or bold statements anymore. He was beginning to see that true authority came not from speaking the loudest, but from listening the most carefully. Judge Robinson's calm manner was a constant reminder of the qualities Jordan needed to develop in himself. The way the judge moved through the courtroom, never hurried, always focused, was a lesson Jordan had started to embrace. It wasn't easy. The rookie officer still found himself sometimes wanting to speak out, to correct someone, or to suggest a faster way to move things along, but he was learning to hold back. More than that, he was beginning to value the quiet moments in the courtroom, the times when everyone was allowed to just think, reflect, and absorb what was happening around them. On this particular day, the courtroom was filled with a different kind of tension. The case was about a young man, a college student, who had been caught using counterfeit money to buy electronics. It was a straightforward case of theft, but the defendant's background made it more complicated. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, and his defense lawyer was arguing that the young man had been pressured by his friends and circumstances to commit the crime. The defense painted a picture of a young person who had made a mistake, one that could be corrected with the right guidance and support. Jordan listened carefully, watching the defense attorney's approach. He spoke with empathy, understanding the weight of the situation. He didn't try to downplay the crime, but instead focused on the potential for change. Jordan had seen this type of case before, one where the defendant had been led astray by poor choices, but what struck him most was how the lawyer handled it. There was no excuse for the crime, but there was a call for understanding the larger picture, for considering the factors that had contributed to the situation. When the prosecution spoke, the tone shifted. The prosecutor focused on the crime itself, stressing the seriousness of using counterfeit money and the harm it caused to businesses and individuals. Jordan could see the logic in the prosecutor's argument. The law was clear, and there was a clear victim in the case. But what he hadn't expected was how the judge handled the situation. Judge Robinson remained silent for a long time after both sides had spoken. He didn't immediately offer his opinion or make a ruling. Instead, he asked the young man to stand and look at him. The room was quiet as the judge studied the defendant. Jordan watched as the judge's eyes seemed to soften. There was no anger in his gaze, no judgment. It was as if Judge Robinson was seeing beyond the crime, looking at the young man as a person, not just a defendant. The judge spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "You've made a mistake," he said, looking directly at the young man. "But your mistake doesn't define you. It's the choices you make from here on out that will shape who you are." Jordan was struck by the judge's words. It wasn't about punishing the young man for his crime. It was about giving him a chance to do better, to change. Judge Robinson's approach wasn't to punish but to guide. The young man was given a chance to prove that he could turn his life around by attending a rehabilitation program and doing community service. It was a decision that showed the true power of the law. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about giving people a chance to make things right. As the trial concluded and the courtroom emptied, Jordan felt something stir within him. He had seen the law applied with wisdom, patience, and care, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to serve not just as an enforcer of rules, but as someone who could help others change. His role wasn't just to uphold the law. It was to give people the opportunity to make better choices. Walking out of the courtroom that day, Jordan realized that he had learned something far more valuable than just how to act in a courtroom. He had learned how to see people for who they were, not just for the mistakes they had made. It wasn't an easy lesson, but it was one that would stay with him forever. He wasn't the same officer who had walked into the courthouse weeks ago. He was starting to see the bigger picture, and with each day, he was getting closer to becoming the kind of officer who could truly make a difference. The weeks that followed were a turning point for Officer Jordan. He had started to change in ways he hadn't even realized at first. His earlier confidence, which had once bordered on arrogance, was now tempered with a new sense of humility. Each day in the courtroom, he grew more comfortable with silence and reflection, learning that sometimes the best way to handle a situation wasn't to rush in with an answer, but to take a step back and let things unfold. It was a cool morning when a new case came before Judge Robinson. This time, the defendant was a young woman named Emily, who had been caught in a car theft. It wasn't a complicated case, but it was one that had caught Jordan's attention. Emily was a teenager, barely out of high school, and it was clear that this wasn't her first run-in with the law. The courtroom was tense, with whispers filling the space as people tried to figure out what had led her down this path. As the defense lawyer spoke, Jordan could see that the woman's troubled background was being laid out before the judge. She had grown up in a family where crime was common, and she had been surrounded by people who didn't offer her much in the way of guidance. The lawyer was trying to argue that Emily's actions had been driven by the negative influences around her, but it was clear that her crime was still a serious one. The prosecution, as usual, was determined to keep the focus on the crime itself. They argued that Emily had made a choice to steal the car, and regardless of her circumstances, she had broken the law. Jordan watched both sides intently, but his mind wasn't just on the facts of the case. He was thinking about how Judge Robinson would handle it. It didn't take long for the judge to speak up. As usual, Judge Robinson didn't rush to make a decision. He didn't immediately offer a judgment or even speak after the lawyers finished. Instead, he sat quietly, his eyes scanning the room and taking in the details of the case. It was in these moments that Jordan began to truly understand the judge's approach. Judge Robinson wasn't just hearing the arguments. He was considering everything. He was taking the time to think about what was fair, not just what was legal. After a long pause, the judge finally addressed Emily. "You've made mistakes, but I'm not here to define you by them," he said, his voice steady and calm. "The question is not whether you deserve a second chance. The question is whether you're willing to take it." Jordan could see the effect of the judge's words on Emily. She seemed to shrink in her seat at first, as if the weight of her actions was too much for her to bear. But then, slowly, her eyes lifted, and Jordan could see a flicker of hope. The judge wasn't treating her like a criminal, but as someone who still had a chance to change. The ruling was clear. Emily would not go to prison. Instead, she was given the opportunity to work in a community program that helped other young people avoid the same mistakes she had made. She would also be required to attend counseling, to address the underlying issues that had led her down this path in the first place. As the courtroom cleared out, Jordan sat in his seat, quietly reflecting on what had just happened. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about sending someone away for their mistakes. It was about providing a chance for people to change, to grow, and to become better versions of themselves. The judge had seen the potential in Emily, just as he had seen it in others before her. Jordan was beginning to understand the depth of the responsibility that came with being an officer of the law. It wasn't enough to simply enforce the rules. He had to understand the people behind the actions, the stories that had led them to where they were. He had to be more than just a figure of authority. He had to be someone who could make a difference. As the days turned into weeks, Jordan's confidence continued to grow. But this time, it wasn't the same kind of confidence he had once had. It was a quieter, more thoughtful confidence. He knew that he still had a lot to learn, but he was no longer afraid to admit it. The lessons he had learned from Judge Robinson were becoming a part of him, shaping him into the officer he was becoming. The courtroom had become a place of growth for him, not just for the people who came before the judge. With each case, Jordan was learning more about what it meant to serve. He was learning that true strength wasn't about dominating the room. It was about listening, reflecting, and offering a fair chance to those who needed it the most. And in that moment, Jordan understood that the real work wasn't just done in the courtroom. It was done in the hearts and minds of the people who had the courage to change. As the days passed, Officer Jordan found himself growing into his role more than he had ever imagined. The lessons from Judge Robinson were still fresh in his mind, and with each passing case, he began to see the world with a new perspective. The arrogance that had once filled him had gradually been replaced with humility, and he began to understand that his job wasn't about enforcing his own sense of justice, but about serving the law with fairness, patience, and an open mind. One afternoon, as he sat in the courtroom once again, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He thought back to the young, cocky officer he had been when he first walked into that room, sure that he knew better than anyone else. Now he was a different man, quieter, more thoughtful, and far more aware of the weight of his actions. He had learned that the true power of law wasn't in the ability to control situations, but in the ability to listen, understand, and make decisions based on wisdom, not just rules. That day, the case in front of them was one that Jordan would never forget. It was a simple one, a minor theft involving a middle-aged man who had been caught stealing groceries from a local store. It wasn't the crime itself that was shocking, but the circumstances surrounding it. The defendant, Mr. Thomas, had been struggling with a series of unfortunate events. He had recently lost his job, his wife had fallen ill, and he was barely scraping by. He had stolen food not out of malice, but out of desperation. As the case unfolded, Jordan found himself torn. On one hand, the law was clear. Stealing was a crime, and there had to be consequences. On the other hand, Jordan couldn't ignore the man's situation. It reminded him of the young woman, Emily, whose case he had witnessed earlier. This man, like her, wasn't a criminal by nature. He was a person who had found himself in a dire situation and had made a choice in the heat of that desperation. Jordan glanced at Judge Robinson, who was quietly listening to the arguments, his face neutral but thoughtful. When it was time for Judge Robinson to speak, there was no rush in his voice. "Mr. Thomas," he began, "I understand your struggles. You are a man who has faced hardship, but the law still must be followed. However, I believe that the true question here is not what punishment you deserve, but what support you need to get back on your feet." The judge's words were measured, calm, and compassionate. Jordan had heard similar things before, but today they felt different. He was no longer just a bystander. He was actively understanding the importance of compassion in law. The judge was offering Mr. Thomas an opportunity to prove himself, an opportunity for counseling, job training, and community service instead of jail time. It was a decision that allowed the defendant to seek help rather than simply suffer the consequences of his actions. As the decision was made, the courtroom grew quiet. The judge's words were met with nods from the lawyers and even from the gallery. It was clear that the judge had once again chosen a path of understanding, not punishment. Jordan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the way the judge handled the situation. It wasn't easy to make these decisions, but Judge Robinson made them look effortless. He was teaching Jordan not just about the law, but about humanity. As the court session ended for the day, Jordan stood in the courtroom, alone for a moment. The silence around him felt different now. The usual noise of the world outside seemed to fade as he thought about what had just happened. He had been a part of something important. He had witnessed a decision that didn't just uphold the law, but also upheld the value of compassion and second chances. When Jordan left the courthouse that day, the world seemed a little clearer. He knew that he still had much to learn, and there would be challenges ahead. But he was no longer the officer who had walked in those doors with his chest puffed out, thinking he had all the answers. He was now someone who understood that the true measure of a person, whether a judge, an officer, or anyone, wasn't how they enforced the rules, but how they treated the people who came before them. Jordan's journey had only just begun, but he was ready for whatever came next. He knew that the real work was just starting. It wasn't about how quickly you could solve a problem, but about how well you could understand the people involved. And in that understanding, there was the potential to make a real difference.